All right, so we are going to continue reading in the book of Jeremiah today. We read the first part, the first six chapters of Jeremiah last time. Today we're going to be reading starting in Jeremiah 7, and we're going to be reading through chapter 13. Now the first couple, there's going to be two major sections here, 7, 8, 9, and 10, all form like one section, and then 11 and 12, actually there's three sections, we're going to be reading chapter 13 as well. 11 and 12 form a unit, and then 13 is a unit by itself. Now, these sections, this part of Jeremiah doesn't give us any dates, so we don't know when specifically any of these things happened, or when he received any of these visions, or spoke any of these messages to the people. This first batch of material in chapter 7 through 10 in particular appears to be a combination of a bunch of different things he told them at different times during his ministry. So I think the reason why we don't get a date, at least for this material starting in chapter 7, is probably because there was no single date attached to this message, since this stuff that he's talking about, this message we read about here in chapter 7 through 10, is stuff that he apparently talked to them about numerous times during his ministry. We're going to see, especially as it relates to the material here in these first couple chapters, 7, 8, and 9, we're going to see this material brought up again later, okay? So I don't think there's any one specific moment in time referred to here at the beginning of chapter 7. When it says in chapter 7 verse 1, "This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord," I don't think there's any specific moment where he received this word. This message, I think, is a combination of various messages he spoke at different times. And we're going to see him do this. We're going to actually get narrative accounts of this later in the book of Jeremiah. So he's going to take this message that he's presenting to us kind of in a combination form here near the beginning of his book, and he's going to break it down into specific incidents that occurred in his ministry when he spoke this message to the people later on. And they didn't want to hear it. Let's just say, we're not going to get into it now because it's later in the book of Jeremiah. We'll get to it when we get to it. But let's just say that when he speaks this message to the people do not want to hear it. And they respond poorly to his message. They do not take his message to heart and respond the way they're supposed to. Okay, so starting in chapter 7 and verse 1. "This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house," that is the temple, so some gate attached to the temple, "and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, who come through these gates to worship the Lord." So he's talking to the people as they come through the gates of the temple. "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, 'This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.'" So they were putting their faith in that temple. They were putting their trust in that specific building that existed in the city, which was a problem. Because the temple was important, okay, no doubt about that. God only wanted them to worship at that temple. Once they built the temple, they were only supposed to worship at that temple. Okay, so the temple was important, but it was not the most important thing. It was not the Lord himself. The Lord was not bound to that temple. He simply let his name take up residence there. And the people had put their trust in that temple, and they had come to believe that because they had that temple and God was bound to that temple, that God, could not let anything happen to that temple, and therefore nothing would happen to them. That's where they had come to believe. So they believed that underlying all of their problems that we're reading about here in Jeremiah is this belief that as long as that temple is standing, God cannot enact his worst punishment on them because he can't let the temple fall. They associated that temple with God too strongly. And in that day and time, that was a very common cultural belief. Your God was housed in the temple that you built for him. And if the temple falls, that's why they destroyed each other's temples and took each other's idols, because that robbed the other nations' gods of their strength. So these people think that underlying all their sinful behavior is this belief that God will never really punish them because God cannot allow his temple to fall. And that is not the case. And so in the end, God is going to have to let the temple fall. He's going to have to let the worst case scenario come true in order to finally get them to change their way. A generation later. Those people themselves aren't even going to do it. It's going to be the generation after them that's going to do it. So anyway, so they're going to the temple. Now this may speak about a time in the reign of Josiah, after the Reformation of Josiah. That could be. Josiah had his Reformation in his 18th year. He died in his 31st year, so there were 13 years in between there. The Reformation and his death, where this could be happening, but we really don't know for sure. They could still have been going to the temple even after Josiah's death, and they just went there in addition to all the other things they were doing. They never stopped believing in Jehovah God, okay? Even at their most idolatrous, it's not like they didn't believe in their national God. They did. They just believed in every other God, too. The other nations around them believed in Israel's God. We see other kings. We saw the king of Assyria. We read about the king of Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar will speak or will claim to speak, at least, in the name of Israel's God. So because I think those kings genuinely believed in those gods. Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh Necho, even the king of Assyria from 100 years earlier, they believed in Israel's God just like they believed in all their gods. These people didn't have a problem believing in the existence of these gods. The question was which God was stronger, which God was the one to believe in. So I don't think the Israelites or the Judahites here in the city of Jerusalem ever stopped believing in their God. They just believed in him. And I don't think they ever stopped going through the motions worshiping him. I think they just did it in addition to all the other gods that they followed as well. So, do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your forefathers, forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. This could be late in the reign of Josiah, when the Reformation was ongoing, but it hadn't really penetrated all the way down to their soul. Josiah reformed, Jeremiah did. Some of them would have, but the people in general would not have. And this could be speaking to that time, when they are saying the right things, but they haven't allowed it to sink all the way in to influence their thought and deeds. Could be. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, that's what they were doing. They were doing all these things that God didn't want, and then they were going to the temple and saying they were safe. They were following the protocols when they came to the temple itself, but whenever they weren't in the temple, they were doing all these things they weren't supposed to be doing. Hello? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. Go now to the place in Shiloh, where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. Remember back when we read, that was way back in 1 Samuel. So after they came into the land, the Ark of the Covenant was moving around and was housed by this portable worship site called the Tabernacle, which is an elaborate tent. Eventually, they settled, and they moved it around from place to place as they took over the land, and eventually they settled it in a place called Shiloh, and it stayed there basically until the days of Samuel. And then they were attacked by the Philistines and lost a major battle. This is in 1 Samuel, the beginning of 1 Samuel. In the days of the end of the days of Eli, the high priest, who had those two wicked sons. That was in 1 Samuel 4. And the Philistines came and attacked Shiloh. They took the Ark of the Covenant. Eli's sons died, and Eli, when he heard the news, fell over backwards and also died. And then one of his son's wives, who was went into labor at the shock of all this, and she also died. And that is all in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel. Now, in that chapter, we don't explicitly read about Shiloh itself being destroyed. But clearly it was, because God is saying here that he's going to do to Jerusalem what he had done to Shiloh back in the days of, at the end of Eli and the beginning of the reign of the judgeship of Samuel. And that would have been 500-ish years earlier at this point in time. We're now in about the year, or late 600s, so nearing the year 600 BC. Samuel would have been around 1050-ish BC. So that would have been 450-ish years ago when that happened. Again, we don't explicitly read about the Philistines destroying Shiloh, but clearly something bad. We read about them capturing the ark and defeating the Israelites. We didn't explicitly read about them destroying the city itself, but clearly something bad happened to it. So go now to the place in Shiloh, where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, rising early and sending. When you see this, for depending on what translation you look at, in here it says again and again. In other more literal translations, it says something like rising early and sending. And then that goes back again to what Jeremiah first said in the first chapter about his call, that God is standing over his word to watch it. So that every time you see that again and again, or I sent my prophets to you over and over, the phrase behind that links back to that idea of God watching over his word and sending his prophets early and rising early every morning and sending them out. So while you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trust in, and the place I gave to you and your fathers. I will thrust you from my presence, just as I did all your brothers, the people of Ephraim. That had been about 100 years, more than 100 years earlier at that point. Now the people of Ephraim didn't have the temple. So the people of Judah are thinking to themselves, we've got the temple. What happened to Ephraim 100 years ago isn't going to happen to us because we had the temple and they didn't. And that is true. They had the temple and Ephraim didn't. Jeroboam, the first king of the north, knew this was a problem, which is why he set up his fake worship system to replace the temple. Because he knew that as long as the temple was still standing in Jerusalem, eventually his people in the north would want to go back there. And every king after him followed that same pattern. And the people in the south are right to believe that they have the temple, and Ephraim didn't, and the northern kingdom didn't. But they're putting too much faith in that temple. They believe as long as they have that temple, God cannot destroy them because he can't allow the temple to be destroyed. And God's saying here that's not the case. But the temple is ultimately just a building. He put his name there. He did do that, and he promised to be there. But in the end, the temple itself is just a building. So do not pray or petition for this people. So he's talking to Jeremiah now specifically. Again, this section here is probably a mixture of a lot of the different sermons that Jeremiah spoke to the people at different times. And we're going to see him actually later in the book. We're actually going to get narrative sequences of specific moments that happened when he went to go speak parts of this message to the people. So I don't think that chapter 7 and following are like an actual event that occurred, as much as this is a sample of the kinds of messages that he spoke to the people throughout his ministry. And one of the things that he was told by God was this, what we're going to read right here, starting in verse 16. So do not pray for this people, nor offer any plea or petition for them. And that's what the prophets often did. That's what Samuel did. That's what Moses did. That's what the prophets often did. And Jeremiah is told not to do that. Do not plead with me, for I will not listen to you. Do you not see what they are doing in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? So, yeah, he does. Jeremiah does see that. We're going to read later on about his own prayer for that. He wants God to deal with that. The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes of bread for the Queen of Heaven. So they are worshiping some false god, or goddess in this case. We're going to read about this Queen of Heaven later, because they love this Queen of Heaven. They're not going to give up worshiping this Queen of Heaven. We're going to read about that later on. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger. But am I the one they are provoking, declares the Lord? Are they not rather harming themselves to their own shame? We can't defeat God. No matter how much we may try to, no matter how much we may wish we could, no matter how much harm we may do to ourselves or to others, on some misbegotten idea that we can somehow injure God by doing this. In the end, we're only harming ourselves. There's nothing that we can actually do to hurt God. We may want to hurt God. We may want to do things that we think God will not like, specifically to cause him some sort of distress or pain. But in the end, we're only hurting ourselves. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place, on man and beast, on the trees of the field and on the fruit of the ground, and it will burn and not be quenched. There's that unquenchable fire idea again. We read about that earlier. Where was it? Chapter 4, verse 3, 4. Or circumcise yourselves, circumcise your hearts, men of Judah and Jerusalem, or my wrath will break out and burn like fire because of the evil you have done, with no one to quench it. There's the idea of unquenchable fire again. It will burn and not be quenched. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Go ahead, add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices, and eat the meat yourselves. They weren't supposed to eat the meat of the whole burnt offerings. Those are supposed to be completely fumigated up to God on the altar. But when I brought your forefathers out of Egypt and spoke to them, I did not just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices. They were still doing this. They were still going to the temple and offering their sacrifices, but they were also doing all this other stuff that they got done mentioning a few verses ago. He commanded them more than just about the temple system or the Levitical worship sacrifice system. There were a lot of things besides that he wanted from them. He wanted them to walk in his ways. Ultimately, it comes down to walking in his ways. But I did not just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I gave them this command. Obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in all the ways I command you, that it may go well with you. But they did not listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclinations of their evil hearts. They went backwards and not forwards. Not all progress is good progress. Okay, we live in a culture today where we're trying so hard to progress to some, I don't know what we're progressing to, honestly. But not all progress is good progress. Human beings can and frequently do go backwards in their progress. They went backwards and not forwards. From the time your forefathers left Egypt until now, day after day, again and again, rising early and sending, I sent you my servants the prophets, but they did not listen to me or pay attention. So he was watching over his word, like he said back in the first chapter. They were stiff-necked and did more evil than their forefathers. When you tell them all this, so he's talking specifically to Jeremiah again here, when you tell them all this, they will not listen to you. When you call to them, they will not answer. Therefore, say to them, this is a nation that has not obeyed the Lord, its God, or responded to correction. Truth has perished. It has vanished from their lips. Cut off your hair and throw it away. I don't know if that's supposed to be taken we read in Numbers chapter 6 that people could take what they called the Nazirite vow, which involved cutting their hair and then growing out again during the days of their vow I don't know if that's what's being referred to or what exactly. Maybe. Cut off your hair and throw it away. Take up a lament on the barren heights, for the Lord has rejected and abandoned this generation that is under his wrath. Let's go ahead and start a new video.